Okay, once you've attempted all 9 proofs, you can now watch this video so that you can go ahead and check your answers. And also, if there was anything that you were uncertain about, I will be sure to explain it. So starting with number 1, if you take a look, the first 2 statements in this 2-column proof are actually given to you. So segment JK is congruent to segment SH. That's one of the first given pieces of information. And segment SH is congruent to segment MN. That is the other piece of given information. So 1 and 2 is given. And then number 3, notice that segment SH is congruent to both segment JK and segment MN. So therefore, we can conclude that segment JK is congruent to segment MN because of the transitive property. And it's not the transitive property of equality because there is not an equal sign. There's a congruent sign. So it's the transitive property of congruence. So instead of POE for property of equality, we're going to put POC since it's that property of congruence. So you have to look and see what symbol is there, and that will help you determine whether it's property of congruence or property of equality. Okay, number 2, the first 2 things they put into one line, and that's given. So instead of separating it into 2 separate lines, they just put both givens in step 1. So now we have AD equals AB plus BD. So this whole segment is this piece AB plus this piece BD. So if that's part plus part equals whole, that's the segment addition postulate. Then BD, so this segment BD equals BC plus CD. So that's another part plus part equals whole. So that's segment addition postulate again. And now this last step might have been a little bit challenging, but basically if you look at the second and fourth line, notice that BD was replaced. So AD in lines 2 and 4 are in the same spot. AB in lines 2 and 4 are in the same spot. But BD is no longer there. It was replaced. And the reason why it was replaced with BC plus CD is because they're equal. BD is equal to BC plus CD. We said that in step 3. So if you replace something, that's substitution. So it's substitution, property of equality. Okay, number 3. There's 3 pieces of given information, and they split them up, and they wrote them on 3 different steps. So step 1 and step 2 are both given. And then the other given, segment IJ is congruent to segment JH, was not listed until step 5. So I hope that didn't trick anybody there. All right, so after the givens, we have HI is congruent to IJ. So again, both of those segments have a length of 8. So if they both have a length of 8, we can then say that they are equal to each other. So that's the transitive property of equality. And since there's equal signs, that's your equality. Then it went from being equal to congruent. So anytime, we talked about this yesterday, anytime you go from having an equal sign to a congruent sign, but everything else stays the same, you still have HI and IJ, that's the definition of congruent segments. Because the definition states that if they have equal measure, they're congruent. So this is the definition of congruent segments. Then we have our given. And then we have HI is congruent to JH. So notice that both HI and JH are congruent to IJ. So if HI and JH are both congruent to IJ, then they're congruent to each other. So that's the transitive property again. But it's not the property of equality, because remember we talked about this in number 1. If there's a congruent sign, it's property of congruence. Then number 4, we're given that AL and SK are equal. So those two pieces are the same. Then step 2, we have AL plus LS equals AS. So that's part plus part equals whole. So that's your segment addition postulate. Then we have SK plus LS equals LK. So that's another part plus part equals whole. So segment addition postulate again. Then it looks like the only thing different between step 3 and step 4 is the very first piece. So LS is in the same, sorry, there's an interruption. This is what happens when you try to record after school. Anyway, notice LS is in the same spot, LK is in the same spot. The only difference is this piece here. So SK was replaced with AL, and that's because we know that they're equal. So if you replace something of equal value, that's substitution.
Fishing makes everything better.
I don't know what they do after school here. So now we can say AS equals LK. And I'm going to get another color here. I'm going to use green. So that's a combination of 2 and 4. So notice that in 2 and 4, both AS and LK have a sum of AL plus LS. So notice that their sums are identical. They're both AL plus LS. So if they both equal AL plus LS, then they must equal each other. So that's that transitive property again.
Rod makes everything better.
I don't understand what they're doing with these announcements, but they're getting on my nerves. All right, so there you go. And notice, like on page 1, a lot of the same reasons were used over and over and over again. You'll see the segment addition postulate used frequently and that transitive property used frequently. So like I said yesterday, you're going to start becoming very familiar with these reasons. Okay, number 5. It looks like they took both pieces of given information, put them in one line. So reason for step 1 is given. And then number 2, notice that MN equals OP NQR. Therefore, OP and QR must equal each other. So there's the transitive property again. And it's property of equality because there's an equal sign in number 2. And then it went from an equal sign in number 2 to a congruent sign in number 3. So that's that definition of congruent segments. Number 6, again, we have 3 givens and they separated them. So the first 2 givens are in step 1. And then that third given went all the way in step 4. So again, I hope that didn't trick you. It's not meant to trick you. You just have to pay attention to your given information. So step 2, we took the fact that both DG and GF equal 8. So if both of those segments have a length of 8, then they must equal each other. So that's that transitive property of equality. And then we went from equal to congruent. So instead of saying DG and GF are equal, we said segment DG and segment GF are congruent, and that's by the definition of congruent segments. Then you had your given, and now you're combining steps 3 and 4. So notice that GF was equal to 2 different segments. It was equal to segment DG and segment EF. So therefore, segment DG and segment EF are congruent because of the transitive property. But it's property of congruence this time because there's a congruent symbol in step 5. All right, number 7, we only have one piece of given information. And we went from saying that they're congruent to equal. So that's that definition of congruent segments again. And then we have FR plus RA equals FA. So part plus part equals whole. That's the segment addition postulate. And then number 4, AN plus RA equals RN. That's another segment addition postulate. And then, looking at step 4 and 5, the only difference is the first segment. Because RA is in the same spot, RN is in the same spot, but AN was replaced with FR. And you're allowed to replace them because we said in step 2 that they were equal. So if you replace something that's of equal value, that's substitution. Property of equality. And then we took steps 3 and 5 because both FA and RN equal the same thing. They both equal FR plus RA. So if FA and RA both equal the same thing, they must equal each other. So there's that transitive property again. And then it went from being equal to congruent. So that's another definition of congruent segments. Okay, numbers 8 and 9 is a little bit of a mixture. You're not just doing reasons. Sometimes you might have to fill in a statement. So number 8, you're given that AB and BC are equal. So using the segment addition postulate, you would do your part plus part equals whole. So you would say AB plus BC equals AC. That's your segment addition postulate for segment AC. Then, to go from step 2 to step 3, AB got replaced with BC. So if you replace something with an equal value, that's substitution. And then simplify. So the left side is getting simplified. Instead of BC plus BC, that's 2 BC on the left-hand side. And then from step 4 to step 5, BC was solved for. So to solve for BC, you would divide both sides by 2. So that's your division property of equality. And then, because we're trying to get the proof statement to be exactly written in the order that it is in the statement, you have to make sure the 1/2 C is on the left-hand side and BC is on the right-hand side. And anytime you switch a statement around an equal sign, that's the symmetric property of equality. And then the last one, you have 2 pieces of given information. The first one is that X is the midpoint of MN. So if you're going to use the definition of a midpoint, you're going to state that if X is the midpoint of MN, that MX and XN are congruent. So MX, XN are congruent because that's what the definition of the midpoint actually states. Then we took statements 2 and 3, and we went from a congruent sign to an equal sign, a congruent sign to an equal sign, and that's because of the definition of congruent segments. And now, MX is congruent to 2 different segments, XN and RX. So if MX equals XN and MX equals RX, then XN has to equal RX by the transitive property of equality. And then if you go from being equal to congruent, that's definition of congruent segments. So again, I'm hoping that you're starting to see some of these reasons repeat over and over and over again so you can get more and more comfortable doing these on your own. So on Monday, we are going to start doing proofs from start to finish on our own. So you won't be given any hints. All you'll be given is a given and a prove, and you'll have to do everything on your own. So keep practicing your vocab. You want to be very familiar with your postulates and theorems and properties as well.